Yeah, welcome the heck in, Raiders. Good to see ya. We were just talking about the science behind, again, the movie Secret of NIMH over on the main screen. Let us continue on. We continue on to talk about the science. So it's the movies has we talk about rats and overpopulation, and that's kind of the themes that go into it, and how society breaks down as a function of overpopulation. Which, if you have seen the movie, it gets really, really much like that. Looking more at the rat component versus just the mouse component. And this is a researcher just like chatting about what the approach was and what exactly came to be. Yeah, so Hanny, so nowadays in mice cages, when you're keeping the mice, if for a research lab, you have to have enrichment for them, because it's been shown that they are much healthier. And so if you don't do this and you just have like unhealthy, unhappy mice, your experiments get confounded, because if you're doing genetic sequencing, for example, you get all these stress hormones that start coming into play, and those stress hormones will end up breaking things more and more. Yes, exactly, Skip. Right, but Skip, why, like, it took us so long to figure that out from zoos too, right? That, you know, their stress behavior in the zoo animals, and you have to have enrichment for them that they can engage in, right? One of this research is going to be used to control large human populations. So Bear-X, this research was done in the 70s. It is considered highly unethical at this point, given how the animals were treated. It's also very, very difficult, it seems, to replicate it. So in more controlled situations where you're actually accounting for many more variables, it doesn't hold true, it looks like. It seems like there's a lot of active differences in between what we saw in this particular setup versus more modern day approaches to it. In fact, there was also a study in the 70s using people, which is now deemed unethical, but they crammed a bunch of high school students together and asked similar questions of, well, what happens if we cram it all together in terms of their stress and their behavior? And they found opposite results. Now, granted, that again, that study had a bunch wrong with it as well, but these things change. No, it's not just mammals, Hanny. So birds need it, insects need it as well too. So the more complex the organism is, the more things they seem like they need to interact with. So with ants even too, we can rabbit hole into that if you guys want. There are studies involving like their isolation, their overcrowding, and if they don't have things to interact with, but they're just like in a barren box, they die much faster. And it's because even they need something to interact with. So it's not limited to just mammalian systems, it's limited to a lot of different organisms. And presumably because having some level of enrichment gives you some active stimulus that isn't just walls or food. There's like something else to live for. That's probably anthropomorphizing it, but it is an interesting way of thinking about it, I think.
In 1982, MGM released an animated feature called The Secret of NIMH. It was the directorial debut of Don Bluth, who went on to direct such classics as All Dogs Go to Heaven, The Land Before Time, and Anastasia.
Land Before Time, for Hugin, for all the dinosaur lovers out there. Yes, Land Before Time, made by the same one. The All Dogs Go to Heaven, I can't watch that again. That's kind of gotten me on that front. But still very well animated and well made movies. And Anastasia too, I feel like my memories of it, one where I probably wouldn't want to watch it again. I feel like I kind of felt a little done after a while on it, but still interesting.
The movie was actually based on a 1971 children's book called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH, which was written by Robert C. O'Brien and winner of the Newbery Medal. Much less well known, however, were the actual experiments at the National Institutes of Mental Health, the NIMH, that inspired both the book and the movie.
So there is because we were actually talking about this, chat, of how much science is behind this movie. Because we've tried for these movie nights to have something scientific behind it so that we can dissect the science behind the movies like after we watched them on Sci-Fi Thursday. And so when we chose Secret of NIMH, everyone's like, whoa, but not everyone, but there were some people who were like, what's exactly the science here? Are we actually going to get some science in here? I don't know about this, but there's a ton of experiments about it. Yep, Hanny, pretty clever, right? Yep, pretty clever, I think.
In short order, the rats should have been able to multiply into thousands. Instead, the population stabilized at around 150 rats, who grouped themselves into small groups of about a dozen rats each.
Again, interesting just biology of the animals, right? If you extrapolate how many individuals there could be, there should be a whole lot more. That's interesting, number one. And then number two is that they form those little rat cliques in the society. So like there is inherent behavior that you're identifying from them, but just by observing them in nature, which I always find is a very important thing to do. Sociality is a very weird and loose term. So especially in insects, for example, the common definition is eusocial and asocial. Asocial with the Latin root a meaning that not social, and then eusocial is more like the colony-based insects. One would argue, Cliff, that like the old argument is that like fruit flies, let's say, are asocial. But fruit flies actually show a very complex social behaviors as well. They just don't live in a colony. And in fact, if you isolate them, they die faster than if you have them with other individuals. And that could argue for them being social. So what defines a social species, I think, needs to be addressed before we can get at that idea of which animals, if that is the definition that only social species need this extra stimulation, we need to define what defines a social species, if that makes sense.
In 1954, Calhoun was hired by the National Institute of Health and began working with the Laboratory of Psychology under the National Institute of Mental Health. This is when he began his rodent experiments in earnest, and was where he refined his thinking about rodent populations and their connections to human society. His first experiments were set up...
And I just wanted to show back on that image. There's again like the beta version of that super society, and it looks a little bit closer to like the Secret of NIMH that we had seen as well, like their setup and how artificial it looked, and like where like the rosebush area that they were going, like all the rats were kind of clustered together, and also like when the lady mouse goes into that room with all the cages and the setup, and like there was all the food sources the same, kind of modeled after these experiments.
This is when he began his rodent experiments in earnest, and was where he refined his thinking about rodent populations and their connections to human society. On the second floor of a large barn, so full of rodents that it was said to take some time for newcomers to be able to breathe normally.
And this was the big one that's like the Secret of NIMH connection. They had the big barn set up with these huge number of rats.
For this series of experiments, Calhoun built 4 chambers in a square grid. Ramps connected chamber 1 to 2, chamber 2 to 3, and chamber 3 to 4, but there was no ramp connecting chambers 1 and 4.
Interesting little setup.
He provided a limitless amount of food, water, and nesting material. Into this rat utopia, he released between 32 and 56 rats, free to do virtually anything, limited only by space. As the rat population grew, so too did their social dysfunction.
Yes, 96% mortality rate, Maddie. Going from, it was, I forget what the actual number was at the beginning, but it was far lower.
Calhoun coined a term for this societal breakdown: behavioral sink. What was more disturbing was that after the experience, the rats never again were able to re-enter society.
Yeah, Hanny, it's very interesting that they tried to then revert them in some way, and there had been some permanent change. Now, what Chad change was and how it was made is very interesting, right? Because it would be neat to have the modern tools that we have now and check if there were epigenetic changes, meaning like changes in the signaling in the DNA and the chromatin levels, like what genes were expressed, what genes were on and off. But since we've instituted like ethical guidelines of how to take care of these animals, those experiments have been very, very difficult, if not near impossible, to replicate, which is a big issue, right? Seem reflective of prison populations releasing prisoners back in society. Well, Bear, there's a whole lot else wrong too in prison societies, right? Like just like the general treatment of the prisoners by guards. There's just like a long like list of other things that you are difficult to account for, right? That we like that vary between prisons and like backgrounds and treatments, and so I think that one's a bit harder to kind of disentangle from everything else.
Calhoun continued his studies in a new location in the early 1960s, at a rural property that NIMH had acquired in Maryland. Though his work on rats had become famous, it was work at this site and its creation of mouse universes that would become his most famous work. In 1968, he introduced 4 pairs of mice to the universe that would become his most famous, Universe 25. For the first 300 days, the population doubled every 55 days, and by day 315 had reached 620 mice. That was when the mouse utopia started to become a mouse hell. Like with the rats, some male mice became outcasts, or often violently attacked, and they in turn violently attacked their fellow outcasts. Other male mice stopped defending brooding mothers, who began abandoning their young and attacking them or throwing them out before they were finished weaning. increased infant mortality and the breakdown of society brought on by, among other things, the lack of space and the inability for younger males to immigrate to other colonies, slowed the growth rate of Universe 25.
So he even has this figures in the paper of like the interconnectedness, and he's trying to model like human behavior and human population based on the rat studies. It's a little bit of a stretch, right? But this is like the experiments that are done. Yeah, so Tiffany, luckily you can't do these experiments anymore, right? Like there's so much wrong with it in terms of like the animal treatment, but this is like the inspiration for that movie. And it is interesting that such experiments were actually done. Yeah. Almost like there's a word like dystopia. Yeah. It is, and there is a darker side to science, right? But that's how science changes, and we get, you know, ethical review panels, and we this kind of stuff. Like learning about this stuff now, we won't basically let it's not going to happen again, or at least there's rules now in place to prevent it from happening.
After day 600, no young survived at all. While some of the mice would survive for another 1,000 days, the colony was by then reproductively dead. No member of the group ever reinitiated any growth. By then,
which again is like very interesting. Like why? Like I just have questions about the biology, right? Of like why they stopped reproducing and like what exactly was the reason for these changes. Presumably, I mean, there's presumably huge amount of stress underneath the individuals, but like what exactly? Yeah, no, yeah, it is the plot of Children of Men, Maddie. But like, what is the biological reason for it? At the same time, the population studies don't contradict these similarities much. Nope. Yep. Yeah, Tiffany, that is a worry as well. I think that's one of the reasons why it had such a big resonance at the time, and it still is pointed at. But there are again reasons why this study wasn't very well done, and like from an ethical perspective, like you wouldn't do this kind of study today. And one of the big issues is now when people have tried to replicate this study using modern ethical guidelines, let's just say, and then they have had it was the inability to actually replicate it. So we can't actually replicate it in a lab with different settings and different conditions. Power to overcount equal deceit, ease birth rates, and higher crime, which then in the decreased, yeah, in the mice, if you're, you know, this is like getting really anthropomorphic, but if you're trying to say crime, then it could be like the attack, right? Like attacking between individuals, and they have outcasts and like different social groups. Like there's an insane level of complexity to that it's very difficult to identify how it all works. I know the auto cucumber is getting us, Tiffany. The auto cucumber is getting us. At least Buttspot didn't jump in with that, because that would have been... Do you think they instinctively turn on themselves because they were aware of their limited space? So Barrex, I don't think so, because so assuming that the math is correct, and they in fact had the space big enough for mice that could have had, let's say, another 1,000 more individuals. If we say that is correct, then there shouldn't have been turning on themselves because of limited space. Like the space should have still had plenty of room for them to grow. I think it was probably more of an interaction rate of them. Like mice and rats inherently like to form social clusters and little groups throughout the colony, and instead of like evenly spacing themselves out. And so that's one of the reasons why that can happen. So I imagine that's what was more the driving force for that particular behavior. You also couldn't really undo the social learning people already did by the time they could participate in a study. Be a stretch to interpret those exactly, Samuel. And that's independent of like economic states too, right? That's also like, how do you disentangle that component, right? Like not just the experiences that they've had and they've learned, but also like how they grew up in, like independent of learning, or just like other experiences they had too. It's very like you can't control for that. And like even twin studies, right? Like identical twins have different ways, like life cycles of how they grow up and like what they interact with and what they're exposed to, and it changes. Like their epigenome is different as a function of those experiences, so you're not going to have a good control.
In the 1960s, he helped form an informal group called the Space Cadets, which met specifically to deal with the social uses of space. One of the things he had learned from the odd behavior of some of the mice was that in their attempts to cope, they changed how they used the space around them. convincing him that people could counter some of the negative effects of crowding. This was an expansion of what the space cadets would call conceptual space, a space in which humans could de-stress when faced with the normal social pressures of their actual physical space. It was Calhoun's penchant for science fiction, metaphor, and literature that would tie him so closely in the public mind to the pessimistic future, and thus tie much of his career to the criticism that targeted just how similar mice and humans really were, and whether their behavior could be compared. During the 1960s, Jonathan Friedman studied high school and
I think it was Dane Karen getting set to, when they were going up on space missions, to figure out the size of, like, how, like, given a particular size of the ship, like, how that'll affect their behavior and having to be crowded, even though there was just few of them. What kind of spaces were important to have on the ship, and what kind of spaces were important to their mental and physical health.
college students and how they performed tasks in rooms with crowds of them, and found that the crowding had no effect on the performances of his test subjects. This, he and others would claim, meant that while animals were incapacitated by crowding, human beings could cope. Others argued that it wasn't merely density at all that Calhoun was researching, but crowding, not a simple measurement of people per foot, but a study of the more subjective experience of social stress. Both of these concepts sparked much more research in fields as far afield as public health and architecture. His studies also served as a basis for proxemics, the study of the human use of space. It was Calhoun's, and in turn the space cadets' main interest, how space could be manipulated, even on the level of city design, to affect and improve human health.
He was working at the National Institute of Mental Health, and that was the secret of NIMH, that these experiments that they were trying to do and, like, create these situations where they're modeling, like, the destruction of society. It's kind of crazy. Thanks for watching SciAntsMedia, and be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons to help our channel grow and support our science outreach and education goals. We can be found on Twitch most days of the week, and be sure to join us here for our next video. Thanks again, and stay curious, everyone.